If you're fascinated by real-life ghost stories and paranormal mysteries, then get ready for Gary Jansen's captivating true story. His gripping account of living in a haunted house will leave you questioning what you thought you knew about life, death, and the space between the two. Join me as we explore a case like few others, with chilling events that would have a profound impact on Jansen's life. I'm Peter Laws, telling you to brace for chills as we wander into the fog to meet holy ghosts. Tonight's case begins on a cold March evening in 2007. Gary Jansen, a talented author, editor, and publisher, was living in his home with his wife Grace and 3-year-old son Eddie. The house was in a suburb on the south shore of Long Island, New York, called Rockville Center, and it was actually the house that Gary had grown up in. He did move out of the house as an adult, and he and Grace had been living in a small apartment on the first floor of a 2-family house in West Hempstead. They liked it there, but then, one day in 2001, he had gotten enough call from his mother. She knew that Gary and Grace would like to get a bigger place one day, and she wanted to know if they would consider buying the old family home and moving back. His parents were divorced in 1994, and his mom got the house in the settlement, and yet it had never felt like home to her since, and her attempts to rent it out or sell it were not successful. Gary and Grace weren't particularly keen on the idea, to be honest, of living in Gary's family home, but they wanted a family and they needed more room, and they figured, well, they could live in it, renovate and improve it, and if they liked it, they could stay. And if not, they now had a house to sell. And so they arranged a mortgage, and the mom moved on and they moved in. Gary was 31 years old. The house sits in a busy neighborhood. There's a church, a school, some municipal parking lots, and the Mackin mortuary that just stands down the street, pretty much a stone's throw away. Growing up in this home, Gary had become very conscious of the subject of death. His grandfather, Harry George Powell, was apparently obsessed with the topic. Perhaps this is no surprise, since he worked for 30 years as a gravedigger at Cypress Hill Cemetery in Queens, New York. Harry would often joke about death and even kept an unmarked tombstone near the head of his bed. It was a symbol to remind him that death was never far away. Harry would also delight in telling Gary stories of tragedy, like the Long Island Railroad crash of 1950, which happened just half a mile from Gary's family home. 158 people were injured and 37 people died that day, and his grandfather would sometimes say he could hear the sound of crying on the wind near the train line. Gary later saw his grandfather die of a massive heart attack on a kitchen floor. And so he was very aware of death and the concept of life beyond it. Perhaps that's why he was so drawn to the hope that he had found in his Catholic faith. Well, on that March evening of 2007, the subject of death had become a particularly personal experience. His 30-year-old wife, Grace, had been pregnant with their second child, but 2 days earlier, she had tragically lost the baby. It was heartbreaking, of course, but they had to keep going with life, and so on that March night, Gary was doing one of those mundane, everyday tasks that parents do. He was going to his son's bedroom to get a pair of socks for Eddie. But as he stepped into the bedroom, he noticed firstly that it was very cold and very dark. Toys and action figures were scattered around the room, and outside the wind had gotten up. He could hear it rattling the windows. And then he went to the dresser to get the socks. But as soon as he reached into the drawer, he felt something. A distinct and sudden sensation that someone was now behind him. He quickly jerked his head to the side to see who might be there, dreading that some intruder might be crouching in the dark corners of Eddie's room. And yet there was nobody there. Strange. So after a moment, he gathered himself and got back to the socks. With a shrug, he picked them up from the drawer and headed out of the room, and that is when he froze. Because he suddenly felt a hand, not just touching his back, but rubbing the entire length of it. And this hand was no ordinary hand either. It had an electricity about it, a sensation so remarkable that he simply couldn't move for a moment at the shock of it. And then the feeling changed. It turned from an intense tingling to a feeling of compression, like his body was being filled up with something that was taking up all the space inside him. And then, as quick as it had come, this pressure was released with a feeling of what he describes as, quote, a million little bugs crawling all over my back and neck. It was a fairly brief but remarkable experience, but he didn't see anything. He didn't hear anything odd. And the sensation dissipated as he headed downstairs, and he just started to think, well, maybe that's an odd aftershock of the flu symptoms he had had a few days before. And so, as bizarre as that moment was, he dismissed it. And he certainly didn't tell Grace about it. She was already dealing with the loss of the baby just a couple of days before. They both were. And so he left it. Little did he know that this was the beginning of a frightening and yet fascinating mystery that would unfold in that house for the next year. The next day, that was 3 days after the miscarriage, Grace was sitting with her mother and sister in the dining room of the house. They were drinking tea and eating Dunkin' Donuts, and they were discussing not only death and loss, but also the possibility of life after death. You see, Gary's wife, Grace, had had a glimpse into such things before. Just 2 weeks after Grace's 21st birthday, her father tragically died at work. He was only 48 years old. And the funeral at St. Thomas, the Apostle Church, was packed with hundreds of attendees, and Gary and Grace were sitting in a pew during the Mass. Most people were crying, including Grace, of course. But then at one point, Gary looked up to see that her weeping had been interrupted by something. He followed her gaze and could see that she was staring intently at the coffin while the priests walked around it blessing. And she seemed suddenly transfixed. And Gary thought, well, she's clearly seeing something unusual, but to him it all just looked normal. He figured maybe she was having a moment, a memory of her lost dad. But later that day, she began telling people that she had seen her father standing right next to the coffin. And what's more, he had seen her looking at him. And he'd smiled at her. She said he didn't look like he had before he died. Rather, he was much younger and appeared like he had on her first Holy Communion when she was 7 years old. She said he was standing there very clearly, but when she looked away and back again, he had vanished. She said, and still says, that she deeply regrets looking away for that instant. And so on that day in March, she was busy talking to her mum and sister about seeing the ghost of her father at the funeral, and perhaps that memory brought some hope in the face of losing the baby. They were still discussing this when Gary headed up to Eddie's room. This time it wasn't for socks, but for a book that Eddie really loved. It was called Goodnight Moon. Nobody could find where that book was, and so Gary went to the bedroom on a hunt, and he was rummaging through the bookshelf when all of a sudden that same sensation flooded him once more, the electrical tingles spreading through his whole body. He checked his temperature. It was slightly higher than normal, but nothing drastic. He headed back downstairs, and once again, he didn't mention this to Grace. She was starting to suffer from mild bouts of depression after what had happened to the baby, and so he kept it to himself. And yet this sensation would keep returning. The day after that, it came. The day after that, and that. On and on through March and even into April. And once again, it never happened anywhere else except in Eddie's room. A month into these strange recurring sensations, a new form of activity began. And it was creepy. It was midway through April of 2007 when Gary and Grace were sitting together at the dining room table. It was nighttime and they were sorting through all the mail and paying bills. You know, the usual grown-up stuff. Eddie was asleep in his bedroom, but they could hear him on the baby monitor. They had it perched near the kitchen sink, and now and then they would hear Eddie stirring in bed, rolling over, making those little noises children make. Grace was tearing junk mail in two while Gary was signing a check when they suddenly heard a different sound on the monitor. It wasn't Eddie. And it wasn't just the occasional hiss of static that you can get with those things, but rather this was the sound of a human voice mumbling. And as it went on, they could tell this wasn't the monitor picking up a phone call from nearby houses, which can sometimes happen. No, this was blatantly a clear voice in Eddie's room right now.
Let's get real.
They both hurried up the staircase to open the door to his bedroom, and when they stepped inside, they saw Eddie fast asleep. All seemed fine, until that low, very faint voice began speaking again, and they both stared at each other in shock. They looked around and they could tell where the voice was coming from. It was Eddie's bookshelf. Confused, they walked towards the shelf and looked up, and peering down at them was Kermit the Frog. Or rather, a Kermit the Frog doll. And it was letting out this sound like a low rumble, like a wind-up music box that's slowing down to a sinking stop. Now this was very odd because both Gary and Grace were familiar with this Kermit doll, and they had seen Eddie playing with it many times. None of them had ever heard it make a sound before, and there was certainly no battery compartment in it because they checked, and yet clearly there must be a voice box inside, and for some reason it had spontaneously come on just now. Gary didn't want to leave this thing in Eddie's room, and so he took it with him when they left, and as they were walking down the stairs, with Gary holding the doll, it suddenly spoke again while hanging in his hands.
This is it. This is it. This is it.
Now, this was pretty freaky, but Grace saw this as no big deal. It's just a weird, faulty toy. Gary was a bit more unsettled because, of course, Grace didn't know anything about the bizarre physical sensations in Eddie's room. But not only that, she hadn't lived in this house before, but he had since he was 6 years old. And this was not the first time he had encountered something strange and inexplicable in this house. Gary moved into the house with his parents in 1976, and the house had a bit of a reputation before that. It had been a hippie commune in previous years, and so the home had been the site of many parties and drug trips. Gary's grandmother actually lived next door to this house, and she would sometimes see the flashing lights of police cars gathering around this home in the dead of night. Gary's mum and dad lived with his grandmother for a while when Gary was very little, and yet Gary's mother felt that they were somehow destined to move into the party house next door. In 1976, she felt she got a sign from the heavens that it was time to move there. Because as she was coming home from work, she noticed a piece of rubbish in her back garden, and it was a crumpled newspaper, and as she unfurled it, she saw a listing for the hippie house. It was for sale, and there it was in the paper, circled clearly in red pen. She felt this was a sign from God that they really should check out the house. Gary's dad agreed, and they viewed it. His dad hated it. It was a dump, stained mattresses and trash strewn everywhere, but his mother saw deeper than that. She could see them fixing this place up and turning it into something cozy, something pretty. And that's what they did. They rented the house at first, did a lot of work fixing it up. They found broken bongs and rubbish, but also a Ouija board, tarot cards. They found books on esoteric and occult subjects that creeped his mother out. But they kept on working hard, and the house ended up looking nice and pretty. But the house was odd too. It would make noise day in and day out. They'd hear tapping at night, which sounded like it had come from behind the walls. Gary was told it was nothing weird, it was just the plumbing. But then they started hearing loud and heavy creaks on the staircase, like somebody was walking up and down them. Just an expansion of the pipes in the heating system making sounds, he was told. And then they heard footsteps crossing the attic. At times, their doorbell would go off in the middle of the night, and yet when they went to check, there was nobody there. Well, in the autumn of 1977, Gary was eating dinner with his mum. Or rather, he was eating, and his mother was keeping him company because Gary took a long time to eat a meal. So she'd wait with him, smoking a cigarette and sipping her tea. His sister had finished her meal, so she was in the living room watching TV, and his dad was away hunting. Gary was just finishing his pork dinner when his mother casually said something that he would never forget. She said, "There's a ghost in our house." Gary said, "Huh?" She said it again. "There's a ghost in our house and she's in the front room." His mum said that she couldn't see this ghost, but she could feel her, and that this ghostly woman liked to stand by the picture window in the front room as if she was looking for somebody. Gary asked if they should be scared, and his mum said no. And he didn't really feel afraid because his mother actually had a habit of seeing things that other people couldn't. She said she would sometimes feel the spirits of departed people in church. She would always know if rain was coming or snow, regardless of weather reports to the contrary. If the phone began to ring, she could tell who it was before anyone picked it up. Gary even writes that she would have dreams about lost animals like kittens and dogs, and then those animals would turn up on the doorstep days later and she'd look after them. Well, after that meal in 1977, his mother would mention this lonely female ghost now and then, and Gary would have no idea how significant this woman would become for him. But back then, as a kid, Gary just wasn't a big believer in things like ghosts or second sight, until something happened with his mother that made him think again. Something dark and deeply unnerving. It was a late night in March 1983. Gary was 13 years old. He'd been sleeping in bed when he woke to go to the bathroom, and as he headed back to his room, he heard the sound of whimpering. It wasn't a ghost. It was his mother crying. Concerned for her, he headed downstairs in his pajamas to check if she was okay. He found her sitting in the dark in the front room. She was smoking a cigarette and staring out of the picture window. She was curled up in the chair, her knees tucked under her chin. She was rocking back and forth as she wept. "Mom," Gary whispered, "what's wrong?" She didn't respond. She just kept staring out of the wide window like she was in some sort of trance. He stepped closer and said it again. "Mom, what's wrong?" Finally, she answered through her tears. She said, "The light in the church has gone out." He glanced back through the window and could see that the spire of St. Agnes Cathedral, which is just a very short walk from the house, was indeed dark. The light was out just below the iron crucifix. He had never seen the church without the light on before. So now it was a dark silhouette against the sky. But still, Gary turned back at her and thought, he didn't say it, but he thought, "Really? That's making you cry?" But then his mother started to hyperventilate. Gary said he had seen her do this sometimes after arguments with his dad. She would blow into a paper bag to help her, and so he went to get her one. And after blowing into a bag for a while, she got her breath under control, and he asked her again, "What is wrong?" And this time she said, "It's a bad sign. She said, they are telling me something terrible is going to happen." He asked who they were, but she didn't say anything at that point. She just said, "Something terrible is going to happen to someone close by. Someone is going to do something horrible." Now, you have to bear in mind that Gary had heard his mother talk about her strange visions and intuitions before, and it had never really bothered him. It certainly didn't scare him, but in this moment, as she said those words in that dark front room, the 13-year-old Gary felt a ripple of fear run through him, and he just wanted to run back to his room. But now his mother was starting to talk, frantically saying that they were talking to her right now, and that their voices were mumbled so she couldn't really understand it. Gary said he felt the room start to spin. He just wanted her to stop. But on and on she went, and the church stayed black, and she kept saying they. Finally, Gary snapped and said, "Who the hell are they?" Raising his voice seemed to snap her out of it, and calmer she said, "God, Jesus, and Mary." But she added that God, Jesus, and Mary had told her that they were not going to do anything to stop the horrible thing that was about to happen. She told Gary to go to bed, so he did, though he didn't sleep for a while, thinking about his mum in the front room that was just below his bedroom. He lay awake for a while, and eventually he heard her footsteps coming up the stairs and heard the sound of her bedroom door slowly and softly close. And shaken, he fell into a troubled sleep. 1 week after that incident, Gary was in the front room watching TV. It was March the 20th, 1983. He was flicking through the channels when he spotted all the major news networks were covering a story from Rockville Center, where he lived. Now, this place hardly ever appeared on national news, so he was keen to see what they were talking about. But then he discovered the story was shockingly close to home. The breaking news was about a 14-year-old boy from this area who had been murdered while on his paper round. He'd been stabbed 20 to 30 times in the chest, and his body was left to die in an abandoned gas station and imported goods store on Merrick Road. He had been sexually assaulted, and a wire cart lay nearby with the last 10 copies of Newsday ready to deliver. The news reporter put up a picture of the area, and Gary's jaw dropped. He knew this place well. He and his dad had driven past it for years. It was right across the street from the hospital where his younger sister was born. The newscaster then revealed the name of the victim, and it was a boy called Christopher Grunn. Gary was startled by this because he was friends with a boy with a very similar name, but thankfully the name was slightly different. They said it was Christopher Grunn, but actually his friend was Christopher Groon, so it wasn't him, right? But just then, Gary turned from the television to see his mother. She was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, her face paper white with shock, and she was starting to cry. And as she did, the phone began to ring. And he and his mother just stared at each other as it did, until she finally went to pick it up and heard the voice of one of the mums who went to the same church. This woman wanted to know if they had heard the news that poor Christopher Groon, Gary's friend, had been murdered. The newsreader had said the name wrong. The police searched for Christopher's killer for 50 days after it happened, and while the search went on, Gary's mother would barely speak to anyone. This experience deeply affected her. She had this horrible feeling that she was somehow to blame. She'd been given information about something bad that was going to happen, but she didn't know what to do about that information or indeed what it meant. She sought counsel from priests and nuns to help her process this sense of guilt and a feeling of being abandoned by God through it all. Eventually, on May the 10th, 1983, a 17-year-old called Robert W. Golliver was arrested for the murder and sexual assault. He was later convicted, and he had lived only 2 doors along from Christopher Groon. And so Gary had experienced multiple incidents in this house already. And so moving forward again to 2007, this ghostly, strange, or whatever it was activity started to get even more prevalent. As the weeks went on, Grace became pregnant again, and yet the strange happenings continued. For example, the closet doors in the dining room downstairs had this weird habit of always being open. Whenever you walked into the room, no matter how often you would close them, and they would close, they would always be open when you walked back in. The electrical toys were still going off randomly, with trains firing up and moving on their own, or dolls with voice boxes suddenly droning and speaking and singing without anybody squeezing them. Grace kept rationalizing these things as the batteries being faulty. Gary still had not told her about the crazy feelings of an electrical surge in Eddie's bedroom, or his growing suspicion that something truly strange was going on in their house. Well, around this time, both he, Grace, and Eddie were struggling to sleep at night, and so Gary agreed to switch places with Eddie. Eddie slept with his mum in the double bed while Gary settled in Eddie's room. And as Gary lay there ready to sleep, he noticed that he had accidentally left the door to the room open into the landing. He couldn't be bothered to get up to shut it, and he fell asleep. And that meant, when he woke up later and gazed over, he saw the open door. But now he saw a light glowing from the bathroom across the landing. Was somebody up? The next moment, he saw a figure. A dark shadow moving across the hallway, and that shadow turned to stand in the open doorway to Eddie's room. The thing had no face, no hands, but it just stood there, not moving. Gary couldn't move. He felt a weight on his chest, like he was being pressed into the bed deeper and deeper. And surely he must have been dreaming or having some sort of sleep paralysis episode. Well, after a while of this horrendous experience, he called out for God to help. And that's when he woke up There was no figure standing in the doorway, nothing sitting on his chest. But there was something. His son had a toy racetrack car, and it was sitting there on the floor right now in the middle of the night, and he had gone nowhere near it, but it was revving its tiny engine over and over. Now, the figure had been a dream, or at least he'd hoped it had been a dream, but this right now was absolutely real. And so he tried something. He yelled into the dark room, "Cut the shit!" And the toy stopped. He lay in bed, disturbed and frightened. And while praying, he got up and walked out onto the dark hallway. He went to the bathroom, but as he turned to leave the bathroom, he saw a shadow at the edge of his vision flitting by. And then he noticed the laundry basket. It moved, very slightly, but it shifted. He hurried back to bed, climbed in, closed his eyes, and waited for sleep to come. By the summer of 2007, Gary was willing to tell other people about the strange experiences in the house. So he told his publishing colleague, called Peggy, about everything that had happened. Now, she was fascinated, and she immediately made a connection with a book she had been involved with, which was soon to be published. It was called When Ghosts Speak, and it was written by Mary Ann Winkowski. Now, if you've ever seen the TV show Ghost Whisperer, Mary Ann is the person it is based on. In her book, she claims to have the ability to see the spirits of the dead and even speak with them. She has even said that she had the ability to tell if a house is haunted over the phone. As crazy as this sounds, Peggy insisted Mary Ann is the real deal. And she asked if Gary wanted to talk to her, so he said yes. As soon as he did, though, he felt unease. Remember, Gary was a Catholic, and at the time he was trying to be more serious about his faith, and so consulting a ghost whisperer left him with very conflicted feelings. Were such things even permissible for Catholics? So, even though he accepted Mary Ann's number from Peggy, he decided not to phone her. At least not yet. But the activity seemed to be growing more intense. These electrical sensations, when alone in Eric's room, returned with the same shocking strength as before, and Gary was seeing more and more shadows rushing away from the corner of his vision. One night, Eddie was being taken to his room when he started to squirm in Gary's arms violently, and the kid screamed that he did not want to go into his bedroom. Gary set him down and went into the bedroom to check it, and as soon as he did, the electrical wave washed over him. When he walked back out of the room, he saw the fear in Grace's face. Once Eddie was asleep in their bedroom, he and Grace sat by the picture window downstairs, and Gary felt the time had come for him to open up about all of the strange things they had been keeping from her. He told her about the sensations he'd had in the room, about the dark figures, the strange dreams, the toys going off in the middle of the night that she may not have seen. And after he listed it all, he braced himself for Grace to look at him like he was nuts. But she didn't. She stared at him and said, "Strange things have been happening to me, too." While Gary was at his publishing job in New York, Grace would often be at home with Eddie during the day, alone. Grace told Gary that she had recently started to feel unsettled during these times. She had the disturbing sensation that she and Eddie were being watched. She didn't mean someone at the window peering into the house. She meant someone inside the house. She also admitted to seeing shadowy shapes and figures out of the corner of her eyes too. And she tried to rationalize them as being floaters, you know, those things you can get in your eyes, but then the figures were becoming more distinct. Like when she was convinced she had seen Eddie rushing into the washroom of the house, only to look over at the living room and find that he was over on the floor playing. She wondered if this activity may be related to her late father. If you remember, she had seen him standing by the coffin at his funeral. She'd even smelled his brand of cigarettes in the house a few times, which was odd because neither she or Gary smoked. However, after a while, she began to sense that this wasn't her father at all. She said it didn't feel like him. Yet despite these experiences, she was still willing to think of it all as just a string of coincidences. Well, after that conversation, they carried on with life. But now they were both aware of each other's experiences. And more things kept happening. The shadow figures, the toys talking on their own. On one evening, he and Grace were watching television when they were shocked by the sound of a window smashing. But listen, the smashing sound was not coming from somewhere in the house. It was like a person had driven a hammer through a glass pane right in front of them. That's how loud and close the sound was. But there was nothing there to make that sound. They still checked the rest of the house, of course, but found no signs of broken glass. Now, Grace may still have been finding ways to, rationalize these things, but Gary was just getting more and more convinced something spiritual was at work here. And so he threw himself into research, particularly trying to learn what his fellow Catholics believed on the topic of ghosts. Now, he half expected the topic to not really feature in Catholic theology. You don't hear many priests talking about haunted houses in the pulpit after all. And yet he was fascinated to find that there were indeed Catholic writings on the topics of hauntings and ghosts, including the idea that their purpose may be to teach or warn or request a favor of the living. He wondered which one might be happening in his house. One night in early December, he was downstairs on the couch reading one such book on the paranormal. Its name was Occult Phenomena by Father Alois Wiesinger. He ended up falling asleep on the couch and didn't wake up until 3 a.m. And when he fluttered his eyes open in the dark living room, he saw a woman standing in the doorway of the toy room downstairs. She had a flowery dress with auburn hair, and she was watching him. With a gulp, he blinked his eyes shut, and when he opened them again, she was gone. Was he somehow still asleep in that moment, or had he just witnessed the woman his mother had seen in the house all those years ago? But that wasn't all. In that moment, Gary heard the sound of music starting. It was coming from the toy room where the woman had just been standing. He got off the couch, he walked towards the doorway, and he saw a glow coming from inside the room. The computer in there was firing up a song from iTunes. It took him a moment to recognize the song. It was playing Hell's Bells by AC/DC. And as he stood there, he felt the electrical surge crossing his body. Remember the one that had begun with what felt like a hand of electricity rubbing his back up and down? Only this time it was happening not in Eddie's room, but somewhere else in the house. And as this sensation crawled over him, he heard the lead singer of AC/DC singing out the following lyrics. I'll give you back sensations up and down your spine. If you're into evil, then you're a friend of mine. Gary switched the music off and hurried upstairs to find that Eddie was asleep with Grace, and he lay beside them and covered them with his arm. And for the first time in this whole experience, he felt truly and deeply frightened. As winter came around, Grace was approaching the late stages of pregnancy. She was struggling with some pain and discomfort, which unfortunately turned out to be preeclampsia. This is a serious condition that can occur in some pregnancies, which can be fatal for both the child and the mother. Thankfully, she was okay, and she gave birth to a healthy baby boy called Charles on February the 27th. She stayed in hospital that night, and Eddie went to stay at his grandmother's, which meant that on the first night of his new son's life, Gary was alone in the house. This was for the first time in quite a while that he had been alone there. He was sleeping when at 3 a.m., that time again, he woke to the sound of the doorbell chiming. There are not many things quite as scary as your doorbell chiming in the middle of the night. But someone had just rung it. Gary lay there in bed, chilled at the echo of the chime, and memories came flooding back of how the doorbell used to go off in the house in the dead of night when he was a kid. He waited for a while, counting the seconds, and then... Okay, no more lying in bed, he had to check. He crossed the dark room and looked out of the window and down at the doorstep. It wasn't clear since the alcove blocked the steps a bit, but from what he could see, there was no one there. But still, he knew he had to go down and double check. So it was just after 3 a.m. in the house alone when Gary went downstairs in his socks and went straight to the front door. He unlocked it and opened it and swung it wide. There was no one there. but he walked out into the street and actually shouted, "Leave us the hell alone!" And then, "What the hell is going on?" And then he headed back into the house to make himself some tea to calm himself down. His mind was racing. The house felt freezing just then, and he sat there while the water boiled and he was praying over and over again. And it occurred to him for the first time since this had started that maybe the time had come for them to move house. That there was just no other choice but to get out. But there was one more option that he hadn't tried yet. Next to him was a pile of books, and somewhere in the stack was the now published work of Mary Ann Winkowski, When Ghosts Speak. He switched on a lamp, opened the book, and he read her story until morning. As he read the book, Gary learned that when she was born, Mary Ann's parents had bathed her in red wine. This was an old Italian custom to keep the devil away. And as she grew older, she started to see the spirits of dead people, mostly those she knew personally, like relatives. She even started to visit funeral homes regularly just to chat with the dead spirits there. These communications and connections continued her whole life. The book showed how she had used her gifts to help the spirits of the dead to move on to the next life. This was important because she said that some spirits were earthbound because of some unresolved issue seemed to trap them here for a while. Well, after reading her book, Gary was impressed, particularly because Mary Ann was also a committed Catholic. And so he decided to pull Mary Ann's phone number, which she had been given the previous summer. He told Grace about his plan to call her. She was conflicted about the clashing with her faith. But Gary had been reading into the subject and felt like by calling Mary Ann, he wasn't asking her to conjure a spirit. He just wanted to know what was going on in his house. So Grace agreed. He put in the call. He left a message for Mary Ann to call him back, and she did, on the third night. Gary picked up the phone and they chatted for a while. He made sure to tell her only the slimmest details about himself, barely anything to be honest. She just knew his name, where he worked, and his phone number. The number was unlisted, so she didn't have access to his address either. They had a great conversation about her book and how much he liked it, and then eventually about her claim that she could tell if a house was haunted over the phone. Was this possible when she was calling from 500 miles away from Rockville Center? Well, Gary sat with a pad and paper to make notes, and he said he was ready for her to begin, and she started firing questions at him. What follows is based on the conversation as recorded in Gary Jansen's book, and some of the details she would come up with are startling.
Is there a yellow room in your house?
Yes.
And that room had no closets, correct?
Right.
And does a child live in that room?
Yes.
And it's your son, right?
Right.
Okay, now who's Mary Ann?
Well, that's you.
No, there's another Mary Ann.
That's my sister.
Did she get hurt in that room?
My God, she did. She accidentally fell and cut her wrist on something sharp when she was a kid. I was a Boy Scout at the time. I butterflied the wound. To this day, she says I saved her life.
Who's Merrick?
I don't know. You mean a person? A person named Merrick?
That's not coming through clearly, but I'm really getting Merrick.
Are you sure it's a person? There's a town named Merrick about 6 miles from my house.
Mary Ann said she thought it was a name, but she could be wrong about that. Maybe it was a place. What about the fact that Christopher Groon had been discovered on a road called Merrick? Gary was getting more and more impressed with all of these details she was getting right about Eddie's room, about his sister being hurt there. But then she started giving even more specific details about the home, like the age of the house and how they had a glass display box in the living room by the window. After a while of this, Gary asked her,
Well, what do you think?
Well, you have a couple of things going on in your house. You have a woman, an older woman. She stays downstairs for the most part. She's been in your house a long time. She was dead when your house was built. You've lived in the house a long time, haven't you?
Yes.
Since you were a child, right?
Yes.
She was around when you were young. She likes to stay in the front room of your house by the picture window. She walks back and forth from the room to the front door, which is right next to the room. It's as if she's waiting for someone. She's standing next to the glass box right now.
Oh my God, are you serious? My mom said there was a ghost in our house growing up, and she described her the same way. I never really believed her.
You should have listened to your mother. She's very low energy. I'm not concerned about her.
Okay, but wait, you said there were 2 ghosts in the house.
Well, you have another ghost. A man. He's younger than the woman, and he's been in your house only about a year. Him, I don't like.
Oh.
I don't like him at all. He's a bit of a troublemaker.
And then she added this, which made the hairs on Gary's neck stand on end.
Yes.
He's standing right on top of you now.
Gary felt the electrical sensation again, crawling all over him. She said that this man was not happy with Gary, so much so that he was actively scaring Gary's son enough so he wouldn't want to go in his room. Marianne said that this wasn't a demon or evil, but that the man was mischievous. He knew what he was doing in the house was wrong, but he chose to do it anyway. She said that she was going to send him something in the mail, a smudge stick. It was made of sage and sweetgrass and was used by Native Americans to cleanse a house and drain the spirits of their energy. Like in Catholicism, when a priest burns incense at a funeral to help the spirit rise to heaven. Well, they talked about this a little more, and then the conversation ended. Gary hung up and felt a mixture of peace and overwhelm. The day after, Gary was speaking to his friend, who fully believed in the paranormal, and she did a Google search based on the details Mary Ann gave. Eventually, she discovered what she believed was the identity of the male spirit in the house. And this information would unlock a memory that would chill Gary to the core. His friend sent Gary an email containing what she had discovered. He clicked on it and saw it open on a story about a 20-year-old man called Peter Smith. On March the 7th, 2007, he lost control of his car and smashed into another vehicle, the driver of which was injured. Peter Smith was in a bad way and was rushed to hospital, where he died later that night. This all happened not too far from where Gary lived. The email said that the man was from Merrick. Now, Mary had said that name, and that it could be a name or a place name. But what about that date? March 7th, 2007. Gary quickly called Grace and apologized for his question, but he had to ask it. He just wanted her to confirm. What was the date of the miscarriage? She checked and came back to him. It was March 7th, 2007. But there was more. Gary thought back to March, and he had a shocking memory come to the surface. One that he had long forgotten until this moment. 2 days after Grace's miscarriage, on March the 9th, 2007, Gary had been reading news articles when he stumbled across a story. It was about a man from Merrick called Peter Smith who had died in a car crash after losing control. And Gary couldn't believe it. He had forgotten all about this article, but now it came flooding back to him, not only the crash, but why it had happened. The newspaper had said that Peter Smith had been speeding. Gary remembered how that had made him feel at the time. He and Grace had just lost the baby, and the fragility of life was at the forefront of his mind, and Gary remembered how angry he had been with this stranger, Peter Smith, who had lost his life and almost killed another driver because he was breaking the speed limit. And within that feeling came another memory of Gary looking up from the story on March 9th, 2007, and being so annoyed that he audibly spoke out his frustration into the air, and he said specifically of Peter Smith, "You idiot, what the hell were you thinking?" Gary writes that he knows his words were flippant and stupid and came from a time of sorrow and frustration. But the thought of that moment made his flesh creep. Because that was the very night he had felt the electrical rush in Eric's room for the first time. And now he realized it was the same day that he had carelessly cursed out a stranger who had died 2 days before, from a place that Marianne had named Merrick. The connections were overwhelming. Could it be true that Peter Smith's spirit had somehow heard what Gary had called out. Can our words have such power? Is it really true that there are consequences for speaking ill of the dead? Nobody knew this outburst on that day, but the threads of it all wove together in Gary to create a swell of emotion of pity and shame. And Gary writes that with a deep sense of melancholy, he prayed for forgiveness that night, not from God, but to Peter Smith. Not long after, Mary Ann's package arrived with 2 6-inch-long bushels of sage and sweetgrass tied with string. Now, both he and Grace were feeling a bit twitchy about doing this, but Gary pressed ahead. He just wanted it over with and kept thinking about the Bible verses about burning incense and how priests do it at church to signify prayers rising to God. And so he lit the stick and started walking around the house, his rosary hanging around his neck. As he walked up the stairs, he thought he saw a shadow flitting across the landing. He wasn't sure if it was in his head or real. Then he moved from room to room, praying the Lord's Prayer as he went. At some points, the stick went out, and when it did, Gary would feel the electricity sensation come over him. It was so intense this time that he yelled, "Get the hell off me!" And as he did that, a dog started barking outside, which somehow felt like it was part of this. The dog scared him, but he kept going. And once it was done, he waited a couple of days more before calling Mary Ann again. He told her how the smudging had went, and she said that whenever the stick had gone out, it was a sign that he'd actually walked into one of these spirits. And then once again, she began describing his house with an insane level of detail that was impossible to know without having been there. She even casually said,
"Are you upstairs on the 2nd floor at the back of the house?"
Yes, how do you know that?
The sense of presence in the house had reduced these last few days, but Mary Ann confirmed that these spirits had not left the house, not yet.
"I'm sorry, honey. It's just that man is back. And the woman is around too.
Okay.
They're standing in the doorway that leads to your son's room."
What?
"Yep, they're standing right there. The man is still a bit upset with you, but not as much as he was when you first called."
And then she added this. Now bear in mind, at this point, Gary had not told her about the man from Merrick, so he was flabbergasted at what she said next.
"He says his name is Peter. He just left.
Is he okay?
He's upset. I think he's getting ready to cross over. The lady kind of likes you, though. She's been around you for a very long time."
Mary Ann kept talking about this woman, and more information was coming through to her from the woman. She said that the surname of the lady was Box, and that she had lived a few towns away, but that she was buried not far from Gary's house. And the word green kept coming through. Mary Ann finally settled on the word Greenfield. She said this was the name of a cemetery that was near to the house. Gary was confused. There was no cemetery around here called Greenfield. But after the call, he went to the toy room, fired up the computer, and he did a Google search for Greenfield Cemetery in New York, and his jaw dropped. There it was. Greenfield Cemetery was a mere 5 miles from his house. In the book, Gary says that he felt like Freddie Jones from Scooby-Doo with Grace as Daphne as they hopped into the car and drove the 5 miles to investigate Greenfield Cemetery. They took the kids with them. There was an admin building there, and Gary approached the man who was working behind the counter and asked, "Do you have many boxes buried here?" And the man laughed and said, "We have plenty of boxes." Gary clarified and said, "Sorry, I mean, do you have anyone with the surname Box?" Well, the man went to a filing cabinet and started looking through females who had died around the late 1800s to early 1900s. The man pulled out one card, but then as he looked at it, he realized it was a 1-year-old child, a girl, so he was about to dismiss it, but he read it anyway. He said, "Oh, she's called Clara Box, and she died on," he checked it, "she died on March 7th, 1927. Gary said he felt goose flesh ripple across his body. That date again, March 7th. And then the man found another woman called Hannah Box. She had died in 1899. Both Clara and Hannah were listed as being buried in Greenfield Cemetery. They were told that Clara Box didn't have a headstone, but Hannah did. He wondered if Hannah and Clara might be related in some way, but he wasn't sure, so he looked around to try and find Hannah's headstone. They didn't find it. They did find one of a lady called Jenny Box who had died in 1899, but after a search of the graveyard, they struggled to find Hannah. The kids were getting restless, and so they left it. Later, Gary spoke to Mary Ann on the phone, and he explained that they couldn't find Hannah's marker, and Mary had a reason for that. She said that, "Oh, Hannah's spirit is standing with me right now, and she's saying that her name was Hannah Jane, and she was known to everyone as Jenny." The same name Gary and Grace had found on the cemetery gravestone marked 1899. Mary Ann told them straight, both Jenny Box and Peter Smith were still in the house, but they were ready to move on to the next life. And Gary asked what he had to do to help them with that.
Do you live near a funeral home?
Well, as a matter of fact, I do. There's one literally across the street.
Really? I bet you've had a lot of visitors over the years. Every earthbound spirit visits their own wake and funeral. But just like regular people, they get bored after a while and move about.
She went on to tell him what to do next, and it involved waiting for someone to die. Mary Ann believed that when we die, our spirits move on to the other side. She said that when someone dies, they become surrounded by a white light, which is a doorway to eternity. Earthbound spirits, however, have not passed through yet for whatever reason, and they need help being guided over. She told Gary that the next time there was a body in the funeral home, that he had to guide the spirits of Peter and Jenny over there. It was a pretty wild plan, but she had been so shockingly accurate on her details and information, as he agreed to do it. He had to wait more than a week for another body to come, which was actually unusually long. During the time of waiting, he said the house was beginning to feel unsettled again, and he just wanted this over with. For example, one evening during this wait, he and Grace were carrying laundry up the stairs when Grace stepped into Eddie's room, and as soon as she did, the light bulb popped and the room fell into darkness. The moment was shocking enough for Grace to scream and drop all the clothes to the floor. Around the same time, Gary felt a strange breeze blow suddenly past him. And then they both heard a sudden strange buzzing from downstairs. They hurried down to find Gary's new electric toothbrush. It had gone off and was buzzing for a teeth cleaning cycle while it was sitting on the charger. The next day, he was walking home from the train station when he noticed movement over at Mackin Mortuary, just near the house. A woman was leaving the place, which told him that somebody must be dead in there. There was a body being held for an upcoming funeral. So he burst into a run home. He saw Grace as he rushed inside, and he announced that the time was now. He went upstairs to Eddie's room, he closed the door, and then he started talking into the air. He said, "Okay, Peter and Jenny, you have to come with me." He spoke some more, passing on things that Mary Ann had said, and then he went downstairs, opened the front door, and he walked across the street towards the funeral home's front door, just trusting that these entities, these spirits, were following him. It was a strange and bizarre thing to do, but he did it because Mary Ann had said this was the way, and he was exhausted. They all were. When he reached the funeral home, he spoke again to nobody other than the two spirits who he hoped were standing with him, and he told them it was time to say goodbye, and that they would see a white light inside the building and that they needed to enter it. He told them he would pray for them, and then he turned and walked away, leaving them on the steps of the funeral home. And as he did that, he heard the creak of the funeral home door open up behind him. He spun back around, not knowing what he was about to see. It was the funeral director saying, "Can I help you?" Gary struggled to find the words, and he just said, "I just wanted to see if you were open." And he said, "We're open." "Good," Gary said, and turned and walked home. He called Mary Ann later that night and told her that he had done what she had told him to, and he mentioned the strange things that happened on the night before. The light bulb popping, the electric toothbrush going off in its charger, and she said,
"Oh, honey, they were ready to go. They were just trying to say goodbye."
Gary Jansen is a hugely gifted writer, and I encourage you to pick up his book on this case, as there's so much more detail and background to it. But let me just read to you how he describes what it was like to wake up in the house the day after the funeral home. He writes, The next morning, I woke up and heard something I had never heard before. Quiet. In all my years of living in the house, I had never heard quiet as I heard it on the morning after Jenny Box and Peter Smith crossed over. It was as if a giant white noise machine had been on since I first moved in when I was 6 years old, and someone had just turned it off. And later he writes, walking home in the light of early evening, the world looked different to me, the way it does when you fall in love or lose someone close to you. The last year hadn't been a haunting, but a miracle unfolding. There is a holiness in everything, and sometimes we need to be spooked to see that. And so, what are your thoughts on this eerie paranormal mystery? Be sure to share your ideas and comments. For more ghost stories and more, check out another episode from Into the Fog. But for now, I'm Peter Laws, and you've been listening to Holy Ghosts and the Catholic family that was haunted for a year. Good night.